Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how I think we should approach virtue theory. And my idea is that we should look on virtue theory as a practical approach to ethics that builds on information we already have and information that is already available to us, and ways of thinking that are very natural, everyday stuff that we can do every day. Right? And I think it's a mistake to talk about virtue theory in the abstract. So I'm going to try and really backtrack here, back away from the abstraction of virtue theory, defining the virtuous action as what a virtuous person would do, who's a person who would do virtuous actions, and say that is not what's going on. It's not starting with an abstraction. What it is starting with your everyday experience. And so the starting point of virtue theory is actually empirical. Who are the good people in your life? Who are the good people that you know about? Right? Think about some people you know. Think about what's the difference between a good person and a bad person, how you tell the difference between a good person and a bad person. Not by what rules they live by or what rules they say they live by, but by their effects. Do you know someone who makes other people genuinely happier? Someone who fixes people's problems? Someone who improves other people's lives? Someone who prevents harm to others? Right? There are people out there in the world that we are lucky to have. They intervene in other people's lives in a way that improves those lives. When you ask them for advice, they give you advice that actually has a chance of helping you. Right? So we can distinguish between people who have good effects in the world and people who have bad effects in the world. And this is sort of consequentialist approach to picking the good people and the bad people. And if we, but you kind of want to maybe put rights into these things, right? A good person is not someone who constantly violates the rights of other people. Good person is not someone who's constantly shutting other people up, right? And it takes some thought sometimes to figure out who the really good people are and who the really bad people are. Quite often people who talk about morality are horrible people. So you can use the whole of science, psychology, sociology, everything you know about what makes people healthier and happier and more productive, and then we value the people who make that happen. And when we are picking our moral exemplars, our virtuous people, we are not judging them by abstract rules, we're judging them by their effects on the world. Just as you know, as a good parent is someone who has happy and productive children who go on to live the kind of lives they want to live, genuinely so, there's no self-deception or denial or anything there. And good leaders do the same for their followers or like that. People who help random strangers. We can pick these people out and think about them. Now, the second phase of this is we do not try to mindlessly model ourselves on any one individual, right? What would Jesus do? What would Batman do? What would Wolverine do? What would the Punisher do? What would the Tick do? We have all of those in our minds when we come across moral problems ourselves. What am I going to do today? Someone has asked me for help. I have a friend who needs to talk. There's somebody struggling with something. What would I do? How would I intervene? Well, I can think, well, what would Batman do? What would my friend Robert do? One of the best people I've ever met in my life, my friend Robert. What would other people that I admire do? Well, that's a starting point for your own moral decision making. You work it out for yourself what you're going to do based on your understanding of what good people would do and your understanding of what people's rights are and people's what would have good effects. You try to be a virtuous person, meaning you try to be a person who thinks about morality, who thinks about what is the right thing to do, and what has good effects. And what this means is that if you really are a virtuous person, you're not necessarily going to make the same decision as every other virtuous person. Rather, the thing that will mark you as virtuous is that you take the time to think through all the consequences and the possible effects of this and the rules and morality, what people actually need. It's a good way of looking at it rather than thinking about rules. Think about what people actually need. Someone is struggling. Do they need to be left alone to figure things out for themselves, or do they need help? Do they need advice? Right. And there's a thing about motivation there, because most of the people who ever given me advice were basically doing it for their own ego to make themselves feel like they're smarter than me. And it's only very rarely that someone has given me advice because it's actually what I need and they're actually trying to help. And that would be a virtuous person. So that's my idea about virtue ethics, is that it's not an abstract theory. It's a practical approach to ethics that starts with looking at people who we admire, people who have good effects, demonstrably good effects on the world, and trying to model ourselves on their behavior or on behavior like theirs, so behavior that's likely to have good effects in the world. Okay. So that's it.